Welcome to today's webinar, AI in Credit. My name is Aneta Buchert and I'm a Senior Director at the Global Institute of Credit Professionals. And my guest today is Adam Ahmed. Adam is a Data and Technology Director at Fitch Learning and an AI expert. There are two parts to the webinar today. First is a fireside chat with Adam, and the second is a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please do submit them via the Q&A functionality, and we will answer them at the end. Adam, welcome.
Thank you.
Great to have you here. So let's start with the basics. What is AI?
So AI stands for artificial intelligence. I think the best way to juxtapose it is as opposed to human intelligence, which would be HI. And I think one thing to get really clear from the start is when people hear AI, they often think about, super sophisticated, super advanced systems, when although that's true, we use AI to refer to any computer system that can learn from data, reason, and replace or replicate, I should say, any kind of human behavior.
So there has been a lot of talk around AI recently. Why is it such a popular subject now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it comes down to a few things. Number one, big data is now a problem or a challenge or an opportunity, so it depends on your mood, for not only your mega cap companies, massive corporations, now actually we're starting to see it become an opportunity or a challenge for, medium-sized enterprises as well. So the fact that big data is becoming a challenge and artificial intelligence is really the best tool in order to solve that challenge, that's one of the reasons I think why AI is becoming more of a big issue. The second reason, I think, is ultimately, in recent years, we've seen the enabling technologies. We talk about the Internet of Things as well. We're living in an increasing, digital age. So that's another reason why AI is becoming more of a common topic today. I think thirdly as well, there's been this very public success of an AI tool, which of course I'm talking about ChatGPT. Now, whereas before in the past, any kind of incremental improvement in research in AI or AI products, it'd really only be confined to kind of the AI community. So you'd have to read about it in journals like Nature or Science. Whereas now with ChatGPT, everyone and their dog's using ChatGPT. So I think the statistic is it's the first product in history to reach 100 million users, or the fastest, product in history to reach 100 million users, which of course speaks to what I'm saying.
That's fascinating. And can you tell me, you've mentioned big data is a problem or a challenge. In what sense?
There's a few ways in which it presents a challenge. I think there's opportunity cost. So if you're not using the data that you've got and your competitors are, so you're missing out on that competitive advantage. The problem it poses is there'll be data that comes through a very high frequency, and it will be very large in the sense that just simply eyeballing the data as a human just isn't feasible and practical.
So that's the data that comes from different sources, right?
Absolutely. It can come from a range of different sources. It can be structured, unstructured. And so just the conventional means that we're used to and the computer systems we're used to just isn't well equipped to deal with that kind of data.
Thank you. And what are the key trends in the financial services sector that refer to AI?
Okay, when talking about trends, I think there's an obvious one, which is automation. So AI is becoming, increasingly dexterous, and it's able to automate a large amount of tasks with high efficiency and make administrative competence much easier for organizations. So I think that's the obvious one. But I think the way I kind of think about it is when thinking about the industry, and of course at Fitch we always like to be very close to industry. In fact, we are the industry. So I always kind of slice into three different slices. So there's the core infrastructure that we like to look at. There's training, of course, which is very central to what we do. And then there's senior sponsorship. So if we kind of break it down like that, I think it makes it a little bit easier to look at trends. Otherwise, we're just dealing with kind of like what's hot right now. So looking at the first one, trends I see in infrastructure or enabling technologies is this new kind of term that's been coined called data OS. Now, the reason why that's been coined is it's a long-standing problem. So analysts will, simply come into our training rooms and learn the techniques, but they'll be constantly complaining about, we just can't get the data we need, data's inconsistent, there's not one source of truth, we struggle to purge the data if we need to, that might be due to regulation. And so the data OS is a proposed solution to it. So for example, we'd never question why we need an operating system for our desktop computers, whether that's Windows or Mac OS. So the question now is, what operating system is your data running on as an organization. And so the coin term data OS is designed to enable those conversations. And so we have players like Snowflake and Databricks, which are proposing solutions for that. The second one I mentioned was training. I think trends we're seeing there, and we'll probably talk about training more today, so I'll keep it brief, is this increasing acceptance of open source. So moving away from kind of like legacy systems or closed source private third-party software solutions, maybe even moving away from VBA and looking more at Python as an open source, much more powerful alternative. So there's been this increasing acceptance. Open source is no longer the wild west of, IT as it was 20 years ago. We have something called enterprise open source that looks at stability, security, and the robustness and support as well of systems. Finally, I mentioned senior sponsorship. So what we're seeing there in terms of trends in AI is, I think, innovations becoming an increasingly central part of their strategy. And early adoption also, dare I say, is becoming more of a thing. So, the term first mover advantage, it's not usually a term we'd associate in our sector alongside tech, right? Because we're used to more of a slow, cautious, sideways crab-like approach to new tech for good reason. Maybe you're a market mover, maybe there's regulation in place, maybe what you do has a real-world impact. But we're actually seeing, move slightly braver move, and I've seen some very impressive and agile responses to technologies like the recent developments in large language models as well.
So speaking of the large language models, for those outside of AI, they seem to have come out of nowhere.
Yeah, you can be forgiven for that, because even for us inside AI research, it seemed to have come out of nowhere. So, I think in the early days when OpenAI, before they released ChatGPT to the public, they released it to some of their kind of close circle. And these are like heavily connected, based in Silicon Valley, very close to the scene, the big tech scene. And I think their comments, the quotes were like, "Oh my God, it actually works, right? Oh my God, this is it." So it did almost come out of nowhere. But in saying that, there is and also quite a kind of coherent origin story and lead up to it. So maybe I'll present you with a very short, brief one today for those who are interested. The technology is based on neural networks. You can probably tell by the name. It's a rough approximation of a human brain model. Okay, these models were proposed as early as the 1940s, but we couldn't do anything with them because they require a lot of compute power and a lot of data. So it wasn't until the 90s that we started seeing those two things emerge almost simultaneously, actually, the turn of the millennium, right? Big data started becoming a thing. We started getting more data from the internet, late 90s, early 2000s, and GPUs were invented, right? So like NVIDIA, for example, founded in 93, IPO in 99, originally seen as maybe some sort of a gaming company, when in fact it's an artificial intelligence company. And then again, I mentioned big data. So that takes us to the turn of the millennium. That's still 20 years ago. So this question still stands, where did GPT come from? And the truth is, in 2017, a group of researchers at Google introduced a new architecture that is something that kind of sits on top of a neural network. It's how a neural network is designed. This architecture is called transformers. And since then, it's been pretty much all hands on deck at OpenAI / Microsoft now, Google / DeepMind. And that's why it seems like these technologies came out of nowhere. So they're called large language models, as you say. And maybe I could just help, before we move on, just to kind of give everyone an example of why they're important and why they're impressive. So if I was to give you a list of about 10 numbers and ask you to calculate the mean or the average, you'd probably be able to just do it pen and paper, by hand. If that list was hundreds of numbers long, you'd probably ask me to send it you in a spreadsheet, right, rather than do it by hand. And if that list was hundreds of thousands or millions of numbers long, and let's say this list is dynamic, so it's always changing, right? Live data's coming in, and maybe you want to do some computations and then use it in a later model down the pipeline. So now it's an ecosystem of data analysis. I'd say let's move away from Excel, let's go towards Python. So the point I'm trying to say is, all of the above are not open problems. They're all closed, solved problems. We know exactly how to do all three, right? We said pen and paper for shortlist, Excel for something in the dozens or the hundreds, and then Python for something bigger. Now, what if I was to tell you that list I give you now, let's imagine, is actually a list of words and not numbers. And now I'm asking you, Aneta, tell me the average word, right? How would you even approach that, right? So it's so much more abstract. And that's what we're asking of these computers, and that's what we're asking of these machines over the years. And so what if I reframe it and say, right, instead of the average, because we don't know an average word, let's say the average is the sentiment of the text, or let's say the average is the summary of what the text means. And obviously language is very complex. So it's very challenging. And so now imagine that this list is now millions of words long. So large language models are not only trained on trillions of words, literally, they're able to really engage and work with textual data. But I think everyone's warmed up now in terms of AI. So let's switch it back to credit. So let's take it back to somewhere that we're interested in uncovering today. So your space is credit. And I'd like to know what you think the potential applications or opportunities are for technologies like the one we've mentioned in your space.
I think Adam, they are enormous. And if you think about any analytical role, right, be it credit analyst or equity analyst, what this role is about is basically you're taking a large amount of data, you're analyzing and then arriving at a conclusion. Now, the data, as you said, can be numerical, can be text, but the tools you have to process it have been quite limited so far, right? So you can take numerical data, put it in your Excel model, analyze it, and then do sort of more fundamental research on the text. And that text could be annual reports, could be competitors' websites, etc.
They could be quite large as well, right?
Could be quite large,
yeah,
and actually
hundreds of pages, thousands. Even.
Yes, indeed. And the larger they are, the more information you can gather. But actually, as an analyst, right, there's only as much you can do. So you take the information, the data, and you try to arrive at a conclusion. And that conclusion can be a credit rating. It can be a buy or sell recommendation for a security, for bonds or for stocks, right? It can be a decision whether to invest or not in a given security. So the implications of those decisions are actually quite big because they are potentially market moving. So when you think about now the analysis and the way it's been done, it's been pretty limiting because, as I said, there's only as much data you can analyze. The data is either numerical or the text-based data is the analysis of that is pretty manual. So again, when you have AI and big data coming in, suddenly they open a whole host of opportunities, right? Because you don't have to limit yourself to the numerical data or the text data, which was very difficult to analyze anyway. You can look at, for instance, social media sentiment, right? What is the social media saying about a given company? Are the comments positive or negative? What does it mean for future demand or future services, right? You can look at satellite images, very difficult to analyze with current tools, but still possible with the tools that the AI presents. What about you look at recordings of customer services calls? Right. What does it tell you about the company? So there's lots of new data sources which you can analyze. And as you said, we have now the tools to do this. So that's fantastic. That's a fantastic opportunity. And I think that brings us to a point where we can, looking at sort of the analytical role, we can say it can do more, it can do better, and it can do faster. So right. It can look at more data, do the analysis that's more in-depth, more comprehensive. It can do it better, i.e. you're avoiding some of the human errors, and you're actually digging much deeper, and you can do it faster. So you can process more information, you can do it faster, and actually you free the analyst to focus on things that are really value-adding rather than just churning the data. Right,
okay, yeah. So what you mentioned there, we call multimodal. So audio sources, imagery, video, text, unstructured. So absolutely is what AI can handle. So all right, so maybe you need to help me guide my questions a little bit because my background isn't in credit, but the first thing that comes to my mind when I think of applications in credit is creditworthiness. Yeah. So is that completely irrelevant or very relevant or somewhere in between?
I think that's very relevant. And listen, we've just covered the tools, right? So AI as a tool and big data as a sort of source of information. Now, creditworthiness, obviously, absolutely critical because if you have a development as big as AI, that's going to impact lots of industries. So, whenever something like AI comes, the first thing I would ask myself is this here to stay or is this a fad? And now, we can probably pretty certainly say that AI is here to stay, and you've referred to the speed of adoption of the large language models on ChatGPT. It's clearly here to stay, and actually it's evolving so fast that it makes it super difficult to analyze and predict what comes next, right? What comes next week, what comes next month. And I think there's been already about a couple of thousand new startups that have been created that are using the technology just as sort of as a new business model. So anyway, so if you look at the creditworthiness, right? So it's clear that AI will impact companies. And I would approach it from two angles. First angle is a company angle, right? If I was a CEO of a company that is in a space where the large language models can be relevant, I would certainly be doing some sort of deep soul searching now and asking myself the question, right, how are we positioned in the face of those developments? So if I was at a company that's a legal company, that maybe it's a translation company or educational company, or anyone who is dealing with lots of text, and that's the core of their business, then I would be asking myself, well, how much is this going to disrupt this, and what can we do to effectively use this tool, apply this tool, and actually propel ourselves forward rather than just stay behind and let others disrupt us.
Or a translation company in particular.
All the companies that deal with language.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly. Yeah, I actually used to own a translation company, and I'm happy. 10 years ago, I made a switch to data science. So, but there's an opportunity, as you mentioned. So it's not just doom and gloom. Companies like that need to, as you say, figure out a strategy of how they can incorporate AI, maybe become a hybrid AI company as well.
Yeah, and again, it's how do you react to this, right? So again, this is a great opportunity for those who know how to capitalize on this. And the question again, as a company CEO, I would be asking is, are we prepared? Do we have the right data? Do we have the right tools? Do we have the right people? Do we have the right skills? Now, I would also look at it from the other side. So if you're looking from a perspective of credit analyst, and I've been working in the credit markets for over 15 years. And if you think about the last 15 years in the credit markets, there's been a lot going on, both on the sides of the market developments and the technology developments. So think back 15 years, right? On the market side, what did we have? We had the great financial crisis, we had the sovereign debt crisis, we had negative interest rates, we had quantitative easing, we had a global pandemic, right? That's quite a lot of things that impact credit. On the other hand, we had all the technological developments, right? And if you think 15 years back, the most innovative thing, I think, on the technology side was a BlackBerry, right? That was your main tool as a sort of a banker. So since
that's super fast. Yeah,
that's super fast. So in the meantime,
that's where
right,
we are now. Yeah.
In the meantime, we've had the smartphones, we had the apps, we had blockchain, distributed ledger technologies, we had lots of things, right? And now we have obviously big data and AI. And so if you're thinking about the pace of development, right, and the pace of change, both on the market side and technology side, then you have to ask yourself a more fundamental question: is how do you prepare yourself to deal with this disruption, right? And it's not just a matter of analyzing the impact of AI. It's also a matter of analyzing: am I prepared to deal with disruption? Is my team prepared to deal with the disruption? And to me, this is a very much a skills question, right? So. Just to give you an example of how we've approached this at the GICP, we've just launched a global credit certificate, which is our flagship product.
You let me see an early copy of the AI section. Yeah,
yes.
Thanks for that. It was really interesting to see it incorporated and given that attention to actually have a chapter dedicated to it, which I think is a really big statement of intent. Yeah,
there is a reason we've included that, and let me tell you a little bit about how we've designed this. So we looked at this and we thought, how do you design a training product, right, that prepares a credit analyst to deal with whatever happens in the markets, right? And we looked at several principles. So we said, well, let's do number one. Let's give the base knowledge, right, all the knowledge they need in terms of the credit analysis. Then second, let's give them the institutional decision frameworks, right? How do you analyze credit in an institutional setting? And then third one, we said, well, let's help them to shape thinking, right? Shape the way they're thinking. So let's focus on critical thinking, biases. How do you make the credit decision? And then we said, fourth, let's give an insight into what's happening, right? There's ESG obviously developing really fast. There are all the new tech tools that are impacting creditworthiness, that are impacting tools. So we said, let's add those four things and let's make it really practical. Let's focus it on application and case studies. And what I think we've arrived at is a very, very comprehensive and forward-looking product. And now, obviously, we're very glad we did that, because if you're thinking what's happening in the markets, how do I analyze this? Well, if you think someone's done this, someone's done the GCC, then they actually have a very, very comprehensive toolkit. So that's been our approach to skills. And I'm very interested, Adam, from your perspective as a data and tech expert, how do you see skills in the age of AI?
Well, first of all, I think the pace at which AI is moving, which you alluded to, it can be very disconcerting. Mm-hmm. Something that I think about a lot is it can cause, anxiety and hesitation about what to study You know, it's almost like trying to plan where to build your house on Miami Beach, right? You don't want it to be underwater in 10 years. So it's the same problem we faced with as well with learning about AI, because we feel like it's moving so fast. You know, what do we do about it? We think about that a lot at Fitch Learning. And I think the best thing to do is to really think about what that common denominator is, and there's going to be more than one. Yeah. So I think the safest bet is to present to everyone today what I think to answer that question. You know, what are the skills I think are going to be ones that in 5 to 10 years will definitely still be very, very relevant. So the first one I think undoubtedly is data literacy. We have to really start thinking about data literacy on the same level as arithmetic, on the same level of normal literacy as well. And it's all about how to read data, how to understand data, how to work with data, what are the tools you need to work with data. Understanding about things about regulation as well is incredibly important. And that will vary from wherever you're located geographically and whatever sector you're in. But data literacy will definitely be number one. So learn that and don't turn back is essentially our advice. Number two, interpretability is going to continually be at the center focus of any AI integration and any AI application. You know, it doesn't matter what sector, what industry. I mean, there always needs to be this forensic look at what an AI is doing. And in fact, the more advanced and how accurate they become, the more it becomes a problem, in fact, of the question, what is it doing? How has it arrived to that decision? And how can I incorporate a human in the loop system so that we can be responsible about it? And that's a really long journey. It's a continual journey, right? Because new AI advancements are coming out all the time. And so you're continually learning about how can I understand what this AI does? And the reality is, oftentimes in industry, we'll be leaving a more capable AI on the table in preference for a slightly less capable AI, because we actually know how it works and we're able to articulate and communicate what's going on under the hood and how it arrived at the decision it arrived at. So that will often be the trade-off, and we're happy to make that trade-off for a slightly less capable AI. Another area, I think, consider learning a programming language. I definitely recommend Python. You know, you want something that's going to be general purpose enough, so you don't narrow yourself in too much. At the same time, have very high capabilities and powers in data and data science. So Python's pretty much the go-to language there, and R is another option too. And I think finally, just developing a soft skill that's relevant to working with AI. And there's many I could label. Leadership is one of them. Communication skills in general is one of them. I think one to focus on, I think for today, is just the ability to develop critical thinking and analytical thinking. So that soft skill in particular will help you ask the right questions. It will reduce wasting time going down paths which are actually maybe inappropriate or not really connected to the business problem. The way you develop that soft skill to ask the right questions is just good old-fashioned hands-on analytical work. Yeah, so financial statistics, modeling, presenting data visualizations, and understand, because in the process of presenting a data visualization, what you're thinking about is the shape of data, and you're trying to answer questions in that process. So yeah, those are some of the skills I think are definitely safe bets for the long to mid-term in AI.
Thank you, Adam. And we have discussed the opportunities and the skills. What about the challenges?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So there are many challenges associated with AI. The first one I think we should mention is just overall safety, which I think everyone needs to consider. Now, I don't think I need to convince anyone of that, because I think there's this kind of really strong kind of public opinion about, there's a lot of fear out there and concern about AI. But what I'll do is I'll give you like a technical example of why we should be concerned in case there wasn't enough reason. So when they were training, OpenAI were training GPT-4, they kind of let it loose in this controlled environment, right? We call it a sandbox. There's this digital kind of controlled environment. They gave it the ability to connect to the internet. Okay, so they were looking for whether it would replicate itself, whether it would conduct or engage in social engineering, okay, which is just strategic manipulation of humans, right? So very concerning, and whether it would seek power. So it immediately encountered a capture problem. You know, those problems you have to solve on websites to prove you're human, essentially, right? And of course, it wasn't a human, so it couldn't solve the problem. So what did it do? It successfully convinced a human on TaskRabbit to come and do the job rather than fix a shelf. It was to help it pass are you a human test, okay, which requires, of course, it requires social engineering in the process. It requires manipulation, power seeking, etc. So very concerning. So safety is a huge concern. And if our people in our organizations are interacting with AI, we need to really have a forensic look at that. Another major concern I'd mention is interpretability. I won't sit on it too long because I've already mentioned it, but explainability is incredibly important. We are not going to let AIs make decisions for us. Humans are going to be in the loop. And in order for humans to be in the loop, we need something to loop in on. And if it's just this giant matrix of floating point numbers, it's an inscrutable matrix, we're not going to have much to say in the loop, right? So we need to make sure that we understand and approach how to explain AI. Another one is, we all probably know this already, these large language models are often wrong. And not only are they are wrong in a very convincing way. They're very confidently wrong, right? So I'm thinking about misuse of these AI tools. I'm thinking about, overuse as well, over-reliance on these AI tools. The final challenge I want to mention is a very important one, and that's a skills gap challenge. The space is moving so fast that the skills gap, with all our efforts at Future Learning and GICP, the skills gap is just getting wider and wider, okay? And in order to fill that skills gap, that's a whole nother discussion. But I mentioned before some things around senior leadership, senior sponsorship. I mean, if an organization hasn't got a CDO or haven't defined a chief data office or something similar, then I think that's a big problem, right? Because they're not proactively engaged, I don't think, not in the AI strategy, neither in the skills gap problem as well in AI. So those are some of the major concerns I think I'd mention.
And looking ahead, Adam, where do you think AI is heading?
So, all right, that's kind of like asking, what's the weather going to be like in 11 days? So we all know we only get 10 days of weather forecasts. So I can't answer that question, of course. The best we can do in AI is understand what's going on right now. Okay, and believe me, that's hard enough rather than trying to understand let alone trying to understand what's going to happen in the future. So understanding what's happening now, as I said, is a big challenge for many reasons. But in the large kind of like grand scheme of things, I think open source communities and private companies are working towards a very similar goal. And that is looking at multimodal, which we mentioned recently, right? So GPT-4 hasn't got the ability right now to be multimodal completely. So they're looking at kind of developing these multimodal capabilities of there. So we're looking at image input, text input, audio input, etc. So that's production and input as well. Right now, the state of the art is obviously Microsoft / OpenAI. They've got GPT-4, sorry. We don't know much about GPT-4, how it was trained, because they've done a U-turn in their open source policy, right? So they've gone from being open source, GPT-1 and 2, to being closed source, GPT-3 and 4. So we don't know much about it. We do know, though, for sure, that they're not currently training GPT-5. Okay, that's come just last week of a congressional appearance by OpenAI CEO Sam Altman, and that was under oath that they're not training GPT-5. So we can say that with confidence that GPT-4 is the current state of the art, and it's going to be about 6 months before they start thinking about training GPT-5, and then the training process takes about 6 to 8 months. So what we can say is we've got a year to breathe and relax and get used to GPT-4 and what it can do. Okay. Now, of course, their major competitors are Google / DeepMind, and their current state of the art is Palm 2. Palm 2 is also closed sourced for the most part. Just because something's free to use doesn't mean it's open source. Open source meaning fully open sourced. The research paper described its training, what data it used. Now, we do know a little bit about Palm 2, a little bit more than GPT-4. We know it was trained on around 3 trillion words, right? So a huge amount of words. That will include books. It will include Reddit and Twitter, and GitHub, and things like that. And that's the current state of the art there. Now, we didn't talk about Meta. So Meta, rather than entering this race, this battle between Google and Microsoft as kind of like the third competitor, they've actually joined the open source community, or they're trying to anyway. And they've actually, kind of committed to that quite meaningfully. They've been releasing models open source, and they've said, we believe it should go in the open source direction. Okay, so that's what Meta's doing currently. One thing I can say for sure, so that's what's happening today. One thing I can say for sure, with a high level of confidence of what to expect in the future, is expect increased regulation. I think we can say that with a very high degree of confidence.
As a former regulator, I would agree with that. Definitely expect more regulation in the financial services sector. Listen, Adam, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for the insights.
My pleasure.
We will move now to the Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please do drop them into the Q&A functionality. Let's give it a minute or two to get the questions. In the meantime, let me just say that this is the first event in the AI in Credit series. Expect more. This is a very, very important subject. We will be exploring in further detail the impact of AI on creditworthiness and the impact of AI on careers. So look out for the further events. And if you want to be up to date with what we're doing at the Global Institute of Credit Professionals, you can visit our website or follow us on LinkedIn. So let me see if we have first questions, and it seems that yes, we do. So the first question, Adam, is I'm a bank credit analyst. It is now clear to me that a job in credit risk will be very different in a decade due to AI. What specific skills should I be pursuing to be ready for the coming challenges?
Excellent question. We answered it already in the talk. So yeah, that concern, the reason why I mentioned it is because that's absolutely true. We hear that all the time in our training rooms. Yeah. There's a lot of anxiety around it. In fact, when I started learning how to program about 10, 12 years ago, I had a massive, year-long period of anxiety of not knowing what to commit to. I ended up learning VBA, SQL, R, Python. I currently only use Python, but the reassuring thing is I didn't waste my time learning any of those things. I have applied some of them in industry, some portion of my career, or they were preparing me to think like a programmer, to think like an analyst, to ask the right questions, to go through the debugging process and become comfortable in my own skin when I'm programming and formulate problems. So, as I said, you definitely want to choose the right thing, right? You want to make a random choice. I'm a big believer in mastery as well. And some safe bets I mentioned. So data literacy, learn it with your eyes closed. Don't turn your back on. Don't ever, look back and think, am I wasting my time? Data literacy will always be something relevant. Programming languages like Python, will continue to be relevant. Interpretability, something we can continually build on in our skill set. Those are the things that I think are very safe.
Brilliant. Thank you, Adam. So how do you set the right speed and adoption strategy for these new AI tools? One that balances the need to stay ahead of competition, but also manage information security and misinformation risks?
So I can't really speak to that question completely because it's more of a management consultant kind of question and it's a high-level strategy question. But I will just refer you to some of the things I mentioned earlier. There needs to be a proactive, conscious effort to address these issues, meaning that setting up a forum, setting up some kind of committee that is dedicated to this. And as I said, you don't want to have any blind spots in your training or your skills. And you absolutely don't want to have any kind of blind spots in your infrastructure and your enabling technologies that are required to actually do anything meaningful in AI when the time comes.
Brilliant, thank you. So the next question is, how AI would change the role of the credit analyst? Do you think this would have a negative impact requirements needed to become a credit analyst? Would there be less demand for credit analysts? I'm
not sure if that's for me or for you, but it's difficult for me to, as I said, look, it's really hard to kind of project into the future. I think what I've tried to do today is kind of communicate a reassuring tone, but at the same time, it's a call to action, right? And I think I'll just go back to that same kind of like formula, which is senior sponsorship, skills, and infrastructure. Right, and some of the tools I recommended earlier. And I don't think there's obviously there's going to be disruption. We all know that. We're not in the same position as universities and schools who are setting essays for students who can just simply write a prompt and get it submitted, right, for their main dissertation, ChatGPT. So we're not in that firing line, which is good, but they also have a problem to solve, which they can. But at the same time, a proactive and conscious effort needs to be made to identify what the risks are, what the opportunities are, and how we can close that skills gap, which is essential.
Thank you. And I think AI largely is a tool, right? So it's really hard to imagine the role of a credit analyst being completely eliminated because AI is a tool and someone needs to know how to use that.
Absolutely.
All right. So the next question is, writing prompts for researching with AI tools will become increasingly important. How would you suggest improving this skill? Well, that's a very relevant one.
Yeah, so there's this new field called prompt engineering, and there's mixed opinions on it. So some people call it just glorified Google searcher, and some people actually take it more seriously than that. I hold an open mind on it. I like to think, like most people probably like to think, that they're really good prompt writers, right? Yeah. And from my experience, I feel like, from the conversations I've had, I feel like, I've maybe been able to find nice ways of getting the most out of my AI assistant, whether that's ChatGPT or something else. It's a growing space. I think currently the only real authorities on it are the developers of those tools, right? So literally OpenAI, if it's ChatGPT, those are the real authorities. Anything else is going to be anecdotal. I don't think it's a science. It was very far from being a science. Let's just put it that way. And I would refer you to a more critical, the main skill that you want to really be talking about is critical thinking. Okay, that completely trumps any kind of prompt engineering training that you can do. So being able to ask the right questions, having a very fine-grained and granular knowledge of what's going on under the hood, at the same time, very high level appreciation of the business value will always outperform prompt engineering, okay, for the foreseeable.
Thank you, Adam. So the next question is, can AI make good forecasts if it's learning about the past data trends?
It can, because as we know, the sun is likely going to rise tomorrow. So we learn from previous patterns and we can say them with high levels of confidence. I think the problem is misunderstanding forecasts, misunderstanding the metrics of a model, not understanding how to evaluate a model correctly. The example I like to give to my students is if I tell you to, build a test for a virus that's going around, right? So Aneta, you've got to go off and build this test. And I tell you, I'm going to measure it using accuracy. Okay, so you build this test. And let's say 1 in 100,000 people in the population have this virus. So you, because you're smart and you know what accuracy is, you cheat. You just hard code it to say negative. So it's not a real test. As soon as the blood or the saliva, gets dropped on the test, it's going to say negative, right? Do you know how accurate your test is going to be? It's going to be 99.999% accurate. And that's because only 1 in 100,000 people have the virus. So even though your test is fake, it will always be right most of the time, right? So there's a huge misunderstanding about how to interpret a model's accuracy, whether accuracy is even relevant. Precision and recall are usually more important things when it comes to classification problems. And so I think not to worry too much about this kind of like philosophical view of whether that forecast is meaningful or not. I think let's have a more pragmatic and practical view. And that is that there are some real tried and tested methods for evaluating machine learning models. Spend some time learning them and they'll be of huge value to you.
Thank you, Adam. So the next question is, are there any value-added activities for portfolio management officers banks could focus to, which will most likely not be covered by AI in the short term? So I think it's looking at what is the value-added human can do rather than just relying on AI models.
I think that's probably too specific to answer on the spot on a forum like this. So I think I'll probably go away and think about that. But what I will say in general is I think I've given a quite reassuring message that there's a huge space for humans. If your role involves high stakes, if your role involves creativity and reason, just because things like GPT-4 can actually pass a single test, like I look at IQ, for example. IQ, it's nice to kind of like know your IQ. The reality is IQ doesn't say much about how successful you're going to be, nor does it say anything about how well you're able to reason with others or act appropriately in different social settings or have wisdom. Yeah, such kind of like very difficult thing to measure, right? Doing the right thing at the right time is wisdom. So just like IQ isn't the best indicator of anything really about a person apart from clock speed, right? These metrics like GPT-4 passing all these tests, even though on paper they're supposed to show reason, we are the masters of reason, right? We're the only organism on the planet that can actually reason at this high level and think in such a meta way. So I think don't worry too much about things like that for now. Think about, always bring it down to more practical things, as I like to do. And think about some of the things I said today, again, about senior sponsorship, because if there's a proactive forum inside an organization that are tasking the right people to think about these questions, you should be able to detect these problems before they arise and position yourself accordingly.
Thank you. So the next question, Adam, is can you suggest some sources available to start learning about big data analysis in Python?
Yeah, it's called Fitch Learning. It's our data analytics faculty. So we're building out our offering. It's becoming very diverse. We have an approach to our offering, which I really appreciate, which is actually we listen to the market. As I said before, we are the industry. And so everything we're offering is going to be directly applicable. Anything from automation with Python. So I remember you've spoken to me before about what you used to do back in the day as an analyst. I remember you telling me once about, was it oil fields you look at?
Yes, production, the oil fields, yes.
For BP or Shell or something. So that's what we find all the time. You're starting off fresh hires, right, or grads. They think they're going to be looking at, earnings reports and the market cap and the PE ratio. They'll be looking at those things, but they'll also be finding themselves on some random website from, Guatemala, maybe government, looking at water levels at a river because that's where the plant is. And right, so you're going to be dealing with so many different diverse things. So we've tailored our offering and our Python training for real world applications. We've got dozens of case studies. We look at automating workflow, things like, can you schedule your code for the first day every month to go to a website, scrape the HTML code, maybe download a PDF, maybe hundreds of PDFs, get that data out the PDF, get the sentiment from the PDF, get the core statistics, add it to your spreadsheet, send some emails, right? So just automating workflow as an analyst and being able, as you mentioned, Aneta, being able to step back as the human and actually spend your kind of bandwidth and brain power on more creative and overarching kind of like what are we doing? What's the business value? What's the strategy? What does this data actually say? Rather than spending time kind of like visiting websites and downloading things. So I'd say obviously that's our offering. We also offer machine learning and AI training as well. We also offer something of very high value to more kind of like strategically positioned people. So allowing kind of like senior placed heads, etc., to start thinking about what this technology means. And so that training is also available. And we also start from the ground up as well. So we're looking at Python from the ground up. And the key thing about how and I'm sorry, I don't want to turn this into a hijack GICP and turn this into an advert. One thing I'll say though is we don't teach Python for software engineers. That's a massive problem. Okay, and you'll walk out the training room more confused than how you walked into the training room. Okay, so we teach Python for analysts, and it will be job specific as well. So that's a massive difference there. It's like going to a university to the mathematics department when really all you want to do is learn the little bit of mathematics that's required for your engineering role or something similar.
No, totally agree. So we have a few more questions. The next one is, what do you mean more precisely by data literacy?
Okay, more precisely, I think I did mention some examples. It's not that advanced, so maybe it just didn't satiate their appetite for advanced concepts. So it's pretty simple, I'll be honest. It's understanding why data is a commodity. Okay, I spoke before about the fact that neural networks require a lot of training. And we spoke earlier, I think, there was this problem we're talking about in credit, which was how to predict credit default, right? So if you're working on a problem like how to predict credit default, you need to understand some quite advanced machine learning algorithms, which you can do with a few weeks of training, actually, full time. But the first question will be your data literacy, right? Do we have the data? And what is data? What kind of data do I expect? So if we're trying to predict credit default, I expect some kind of tabular data. If I was working on the problem myself, I'd expect many, many observations. Okay, they could be people, or could be clients or companies. I'd expect many different features, right? So what kind of data are you collecting? And finally, the concept of a label or an answer. So in my data set, I'd want to know historically whether the default happened or not, right? Otherwise the data is pretty useless to me. So just understanding what the different shapes and size of how data turns up, where you get it from, as I said, regulation around it too. So here in the UK, we have GDPR. It's very important to understand these regulations that pertain to your field of expertise. And just think of it, as I said before, as crucial as things like arithmetic, basic arithmetic. Everyone should understand the data and how it applies to our roles.
Thank you, Adam. So the next question we actually have quite a few questions. We may run out of time in answering them all.
That's okay. It's a popular topic.
It's a very popular topic.
Thanks to ChatGPT. Well, actually, way before that, but.
And the next question is actually a very good question. Well, all of them are very good, but this one is a very interesting one. If AI is already helping with coding, why learn Python? The AI help write the code, or are we fearful that unless we know coding, we won't know what the AI is doing?
Yeah, well, that's the answer. That's one answer, I should say. So absolutely, we're not going to find ourselves in a position anytime soon where an AI will write the code and give it to some strategic leadership figure, right? And that leadership figure will press a button and execute it. First of all, who's going to ask for the code? And what are you asking for in the code, right? And where are you going to deploy it? What kind of infrastructure? How often are you going to revisit the code when variables change, right? How are you going to debug the code? How are you going to ensure that it's code you want in the first place rather than anything else? So programmers are still required, and they will always be required for the foreseeable. Things could change in the future, right? But I've tried my best to provide some answers about what to learn that I think are probably the safest bet. So to go back to our metaphor, build your house as far away as possible from that Miami coast while still having a view of the sea.
Adam, thank you so much. I'm afraid we're running out of time. Thank you so much for all the questions. I think the number of questions tells me we need to invite you again and have another session. It's a hugely popular subject. Thank you everyone for joining. Please do follow us for further events. We will be doing more in the space of AI, so hopefully we'll be able to dig in a little deeper on the side of creditworthiness and also impact on the careers. So again, thank you for your time and hopefully see you soon again.